thanks for joining me. I know you have a lot of choices. There's so many good sessions going on, and so I appreciate it that you've decided to spend a few minutes with us in the session about successfully communicating with our peers and our colleagues. And, the studies are pretty clear. If you're a technologist and all you want to do in your career is technology, then you don't have to pay attention to soft skills. Just be really good at technology. But if you yearn to be something more than just a technologist, if you want to be an advisor to the business elements of the organization you work in, if you want to be a leader, if you want to be a person who changes opinions, then you need to work on your soft skills. You need to work on your ability to communicate. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, okay? I encourage you to ask any kind of questions that you might have as we go along. I actually have 2 full days of training around leadership skills, communication skills, and soft skills for the IT professional, specifically targeted at us because we have certain biases and certain ways that we like to approach interacting with other people, some of which help us and some of which not so much help us, right? So like all people, we have our own quirks, and so hopefully this will be meaningful and useful information for you, not just today and not just in IT, but in all of your interactions, right? So next couple slides I'm going to show are boilerplate. You will be sick of them by the end of the week. How many of us are here for the first time? Oh, wow, awesome, welcome. Unlike you, I have been at every past summit. I think I'm one of a dozen people who have been here. So I sure hope you get a lot out of this session. There's so much to do, and I will tell you this. If you are looking and trying to decide between the 3 different sessions you want to go to at any one given hour, do this instead. Buy the videos, and then talk to these amazing people that you've met just now in the hall. Right? Because this is the only place in the world where you're going to meet 4,000 other people who are ecstatic about SQL Server. Right? You'll not be able to do that anywhere else. But you can learn technical information at your desk. Right? So get those videos. Get the boss to pay for it. Or if you are a boss, pay for it for your people. That way they can continue to learn year-round, and you can do stuff here at the Past Summit that can only be done at the Past Summit. Okay? So that's my advice. My name is Kevin Kline, Principal Program Manager at SentryOne. Come see me down in the exhibit hall when I'm not speaking in sessions. Then that's where I'll be, and I'm always happy to share. I mentor several people every year and do different things like that. I'm always happy to give advice, so if you have any questions, love to help you out in any way that I can. So, turn on my clicker here. So, be considerate of others, right? Sound familiar? Also, don't forget, PASS is not just a conference. PASS is a year-round event, year-round community. And so I'm actually going to be speaking for about 45 minutes on Friday on this topic of what else is there for you to do in the PASS community after you've left the summit. There's so many different things. Lots of stuff online every month. There's couple dozen different presentations happening every single month. So lots of great information, lots of different people you can interact with. There's events that are past sponsored happening all over the world, around the globe. So not just a one-time event, a big conference every year. It is an ongoing community of people with similar goals and similar interests and similar shared struggles, right? So, my name is Kevin Kline. Just a little bit about me on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, all of those places, K.E. Kline. And I encourage you to connect with me there. Also, my email address is kkline@centuryone.com or kekline@outlook.com if you want to email me for any questions or follow up. I was one of the original 9 people that got together and founded the organization. At that time, I was the leader of the database management team at one of the big 4 accounting firms. So we were one of the biggest SQL Server shops during the 90s. And I was president for a couple years back in the early 2000s, back before there was Facebook Does anyone, some of you might remember that. Yeah. So I wasn't actually the first president, I was the third president, but people keep thinking I'm the first president because I was president when Facebook came out. That's the only advantage I had. You know, I'm an expert in SQL and performance tuning queries, query tuning and things like that. So I hope you come to my query tuning session tomorrow. All right, so another cool thing that PASS has started to do this year, and it makes a lot of sense, is this concept of a learning pathway. So what we've discovered as an organization is that people want not just topics that are interesting, but we want curriculum, right? We don't want to just learn one point of information. We want to be able to go through a progression of different skills and related topics that take us from maybe a novice level to intermediate, or maybe from intermediate to expert, those sort of things. That's what the learning pathways are designed to solve. And so mine is the first in a three-part pathway, learning pathway for communications. And tomorrow we have Denise McInerney, who will be presenting about communicating with kind of people on the customer side, the people who you are serving and interacting with in that way. And then on Friday, Edwin Sarmiento is doing a session on communicating upward. Because if you don't manage your relationship upward to your boss and their boss, it'll manage you, right? So these are all designed to help you advance your skill set when it comes to those interpersonal relationships and communication scenarios that are fraught with potential disaster if we don't keep an eye on that. Another thing that's really important for PASS is that we didn't always, but we do now pay a lot of attention to data, okay? And so it's up to you to give us the data that we can put into this positive feedback loop that improves what we offer to the community, right? So on the one hand, you could tell PASS that this was a terrible session and never invite Kevin back, and I won't be back. On the other hand, you could say this was great, we need more of this, and then they could bring myself and other people who also add more to this discussion later on, right? So that's driven very, very strongly by you, and in other ways too, like how big of a room do each of the different speakers get? You know, from little decisions like how big of a room to big decisions like whether we focus a lot more on that technology or not. It's all up to you, and it's very, very important. Anyone here ever done a data wrangling kind of set of work in a data science project? A few of us? Well, the joke about data science is 80% of the work is cleaning the data before you do the other 80% of the work, right? And so that's what we need here, right? The old saying, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. We need you to give us not garbage, right? And the more of that we can get, the better. So what's our agenda today? So effective communications begins with actually understanding more about ourselves. So we're going to talk about self-awareness, and then we're going to dive into a variety of the different best practices that apply our own awareness of ourselves to our communication challenges. And this session is targeted towards communicating with our peers. Okay? This is not about public speaking. Right? This is not about presentations. I'm not going to try to tell you anything about even how to settle arguments. Although, if you have a question for that and we have time for that, you know, I'm very familiar with a lot of different tools and techniques to do that. So if we have time, that's on your mind, we can talk about it. What this is about is you can kind of see from the start to the end, it's about how to use communications, not just to make your thoughts and your thinking clear, it's also about how to make your thinking more persuasive, okay? Does anyone here want to be less persuasive? Anyone? Want to be less influential? It happens sometimes, but I don't know those people. I think that it was an episode of The Twilight Zone I saw. So let's talk about some introductory concepts to communication. This is the kind of stuff that even if you've never really thought about it systemically, it's all going to make sense. You're going to understand all of this. Believe it or not, most of these concepts and ideas have really only been recently systematized. probably since World War II. However, when we look for antecedents, we look to history to see when did these concepts first get discussed, we see that this is as ancient as, at least as Western civilization itself, okay? So when we think about communications, there's a very simple kind of loop when we have communications. We've got a person who wants to send a message of some kind, right? Now, when I say communication, leave your mind open a little bit, right? I am someone who wants to transmit a message. I have to put that in to a message medium, right? So if I speak American Sign Language, it's going to be different than if you speak spoken English. Does anyone here speak sign language? So one of the things that's really interesting is with sign language, when you can read it, is that you'll find out that they don't talk the way that you and I talk. They leave out tons of things that you and I would include in our verbiage, right? Because it takes a lot of time and energy to make these motions, right? So they find shortcuts for that. So there's this process of encoding, and then we have the message. And so much goes wrong in our life because what we put into this message is going to have issues because the person who receives that message has experiences and thought processes that mean when they come around to catching that and decoding it on their side, it doesn't make sense. So I'll give you an example of this. Well, let me finish the loop here in just a second. So the person receiving it will typically, okay, they think about what you've said, and they're like, okay, I'm going to give you feedback. Usually the feedback is just very direct. It's, I acknowledge what you have said, right? And then they might say, okay, now I have a question to follow up on that, so I'm giving you feedback as well. And then in spite of everything else that's going on, we have noise. We have all of these things that we have to filter out and process through despite the quality of the message, okay? So on the decoding side, my first marriage ended in 2005. A year later, I started to date again. And Rachel, my wife now, she said, at one point she said something about, oh, if you weren't such a punk, you would do such and such. Now for her, I'm from the South. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. But she's from the South with a capital S. And for her, punk just meant not being real grown up about something, right? But for me, punk meant a thug, right? So how do you think that particular session of communicating went? I think it ended in tears at some point, yeah. I think it was mostly mine. Right, so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, this encoding and decoding. We have our own internal vocabulary that can be very different, me to you, right? And words that we think are absolutely obvious are not always. Like my oldest son, who's 28, he's one of these kind of kids. He grew up in an educated, smart household, but he didn't actually learn what half of the words meant that his mom and I were talking, his stepmom and I were talking about. So he'll say, I saw an allegory on the banks of the Nile. That kind of stuff, right? So that's the problem we have with encoding and decoding, is that people, maybe they think they know what it means, but they don't. Conversely, they have a meaning for the word, and it's not the same. And then on top of that, we have this situation where the noise can be broken out into all kinds of different subcategories. So if you were to be a communication major, they would tell you about things like bias, right? Selective filtering, selective perception, information overload, conversely, emotional overload. Who do you think gets accused of that more often in terms of gender? Women, right? And who do you think gets accused of information overload more often in terms of, let's say, job roles? Information overload. Every manager who has not gone through the ranks as an IT person has someone on their team who's like, I just wish they'd give me less details, right? You are giving me so much information. Could you shut up with the information, give me some opinions about what's going to be a better choice here? You know, that kind of thing. So this noise thing is many faceted. And then there's all kinds of biases that we bring to this endeavor of communication. Have you ever heard of the adage that says women communicate for rapport and men communicate for report? Anyone believe that gender stereotyping is actually pretty accurate? Anyone? I actually kind of do. Because I know if I'm talking to a buddy and it's beyond, we're work friends, it's like, why did you interrupt me? Right? What's going on? Tell me what this is about. However, if I am hanging out with my daughters, it could be a good 15 minutes before they tell me why they have interrupted me. It's like, please. It's like, well, Sandra came down and she said, I need to talk about this and such with my tires, but that wasn't really what I wanted to ask you about. It was about, hey, have you heard this new? I'm like, please, focus. So that's all my experience with my kids. Okay, so don't take that to be real world stuff. But this is important, extremely important. Keep that in mind when we communicate. If we frame a set of thoughts that we want to send out as a message, is it something that the other person can receive? And so we interact very, very frequently with people, and it may be us, maybe someone you know. We interact with people who don't take 1 minute to think about how you will receive and process this information, right? And it makes it hard. You're like, oh my gosh, this person is coming into my office again. How long is it going to take for me to figure out what the heck they really want, right? However, we live in a world a little bit different than even just a few years ago. Anyone use Slack? Something like that? Or IM? Or use Facebook Messenger? So much of what we are talking about is communicated in nonverbal aspects of the message, right? So one thing I can do here on this stage to impart a greater sense of gravitas and gravity to a particular message is I can slow it down. You're like, oh, that must be important, right? Or I can speed it up if it's not really that important. We can just go right past it, right? Just little tiny things like that in the non-word for word transliteration of what I'm saying can completely change the dynamic. And then there is all of the characteristics of communication, like body language, right? Like intonation. So I thought briefly about including a picture of myself in high school when I realized that I was debilitatingly shy. Okay? I was so shy that it was harming myself. I realized this. And so I signed up to take theater because I wanted to break myself of this habit. And one of the first things that told me that I am horrible about communication and so forth was I saw a picture of myself that was going to go into the school, the annual, where you have your picture in there every year. And I was smiling like this. Right? It's like a grimace. It's like what a Wolverine does when it shows its teeth. It's like, wow, I am not good at this. And so, that doesn't project what I was feeling on the inside. And so one kind of sidebar message to this slide is if you do struggle at all with communications, it feels so unnatural at first, but you can actually practice this stuff and get better at it. And so I actually sat down in front of a mirror and was like, how does that, no, that's not right. How does this, and I practiced smiling for like off and on for a couple weeks until I finally got to where I could do that and not look like I was either a violent homicidal maniac or, how to be genuine, with something just simple like that. Same thing with intonation. Anyone here enjoy hearing recordings of yourself? Oh, God, it's awful. But if you do want to get to a point where communication in a verbal sense, how you vocalize, is a very important kind of skill to master. And so for me, I don't even think about it anymore, but there was a time where I would have to say to myself, okay, you've been at a monotone in your words for such a long time, you need to do an up. at this particular point, or you need to take it down a little bit. You learn those kind of things, and it gives your communication a greater naturalness. It makes it feel more genuine, and also enables people to focus on what is important in your particular words. We have a lot of filler in the sentences that we speak, and some of it is exceptionally important, and a lot of it can go by the wayside, right? And so intonation and your cadence can make a huge difference. And then I also like to point out, there's this whole study called semiotics, the study of symbols. And this is riddled. Our whole society is just speckled through with symbols that we don't even think about. But they convey an enormous communicative power, okay? So I travel a lot in my job, and here's an example related to that. Is there any reason why airline pilots need to have ranks? They have gold and silver stripes on their sleeves. They have 2 or 3 or 4 on their. Any reason that we need to know that? It's all about what they want us to feel about. If they're communicating on, you can trust this person, right? You don't have to think twice. They know what they are doing. And so you'll see people who are really smart and deliberate about the way they communicate will bring certain symbols to bear in a non-verbal way, and it changes the whole dynamic of their conversation, right? You ever had a salesperson come into your office? How many of them dress like we dress? Our joke is always, oh, we can tell the salespeople are in the building because they got ties and suits on, right? They're not trying to impress us, though. Who are they trying to impress? The people who are wearing ties and suits, right? The VP, the EVP, the senior VP, right? And then they always open that leather-bound, right? Oh. And they have a big shiny watch, right? That's what's happening here, okay? It's not for us, it's for the people above us, that they are trying to send a message that you could trust me, I know what I'm doing. Now, here's another little tidbit that's interesting. We see this in Western society in the sense of what they call micro-expressions. But throughout the world, there are 7 universal expressions. If you show this to a tribalist in Papua New Guinea, and you show this to someone from middle society in Bangalore, and you show this to an upper crust blue blood in Boston, Massachusetts, they will be able to tell you which person here is mad, right? There's actually 16 expressions that about 80% of the world will recognize. But there's a few places that do it a little differently, so they don't include those in the same kind of category because some societies have different meanings for a few of those 16 expressions. Which person here has just smelled something awful? The lady in the middle, right? Well, that's disgust, and it's universal, right? You bring a meal out anywhere in the world, and the person makes that face, we already know how this meal is going to go, right? Which incidentally looks kind of like my mom every time I tried to make a dinner. Anyway, so there's so much communication that happens non-verbally, and we live in a world where it used to be, as technologists, we had either in person, occasionally a voice conversation, or just text. Now, with things like GoToMeeting and Zoom and Slack and so forth, we can bring a lot of this back into play. And if you're able to do that, and you're deliberate, you're aware of the power that that can provide for you, then this is actually something you should take advantage of. If you had to choose, in talking to your team, whether you wanted to use something that could show your face and your body or not, what would be the right circumstance to do that? Yes. If you're giving bad news, yes. In fact, let's expand that a little bit. Anytime the message is one of emotional heft, it could be exceptionally good news. I would encourage you to use something that can show your face. You ever have a coworker or friend who tries to type in their sarcasm? How did that go? Right. They'll learn sooner or later, right, that this is a no-no. If you want to bring some kind of emotional impact to your message, you will benefit greatly from being able to show the nonverbal aspects of that. Like, hey, I've got bad news. This is serious. Or conversely, it's like, hey, I just want everyone here to know what a great job Jeremy has been doing, and Jeremy's going to get a promotion. Woo, right? That's a good time to bring in face-to-face. Let's all show our faces to each other in this meeting, okay? By the way, if you download the slide decks, I've got tons of notes in there with references back to the different research that backs up these different thoughts and so forth. So I mentioned before that self-awareness is extremely important. Part of the reason for that is if you don't have a lot of awareness about yourself and your own biases and your own kinds of thought processes and experiences, then when you send out your message, you encode it and send it out, you're going to make a lot more mistakes than if you know who you are and who they are, and then you adjust accordingly. And I guess if I could distill it down, this whole session down, that would probably be one of the 3 core lessons to learn about being really good at communications is know who you are and who they are, and then adjust, right? Don't do the same message for every person in every situation in the same way. You will get widely different results. Does anybody remember this commercial?
Yeah.
Remember that one? Yeah, John Hodgman, he's like, I'm a stiff PC. And Justin Long's like, I'm a cool Mac. And then we live in a world where we've got this, I'm a Linux. And, these guys are like, who the heck is this crazy man? If you have not ever done this, by the way, you ever talked to a Linux person back in those days? It's like, I hope you know TCP/IP because they're going to be talking to you in that level of code. It's like, well, what was your root address for your It's like, shut up. So these people know who they are. And we know how to deal with this person in the middle. We know how to deal with a Linux person as a technologist because we've dealt with that kind of personality type before. Who's the most dangerous person up here? It's this pointy-haired boss, right? Who's got no self-awareness. No matter what you do, they never seem to know the emotional impact of what they're talking about. And so, these colors are kind of terrible. I apologize for these colors. There are organizations that use things like what are called psychometric tests. They use them to actually select people for specific jobs and things like that. I'm not a proponent of that. But I have spent a lot of time studying the different kinds of psychometric tests. I've taken many of them. My brother is an accredited trainer in Myers-Briggs, and so he experimented on me when he was getting those accreditations. I've learned a lot about these things, and they are fantastic for learning more about yourself. If we have time, and I don't think we will, but if we have time, I even have a 5-minute DISC test that we could take at the end if you've never gone through the effort to do that. Anyone here taken the DISC assessment? Okay, a few of us. How about MTBI, Myers-Briggs? Okay, a few of us? Yeah, cool. Anyone heard of this one? The Big 5 markers. So, again, one more question. Anyone seen the TV show Adam Ruins Everything? It's really funny. It's on True TV. And he does one on these tests. And he kind of says they're not necessarily scientific. And there is some truth to that. And that's why I don't agree with this idea of using it as a barrier to give people a job, right? But they are all really, really good for self-discovery and much better than something like a horoscope. There is some study in these, right? I mean, it's not just pulled out of, made from whole cloth. Now, DISC measures 4 specific kind of behavioral orientations. So D is for dominance, I is for inspiration, S is for stability, and C is for compliance. I've also heard it used as caution. And among DBAs, what do you think their leading indicator would be? Does anyone want to hazard a guess? Caution, yeah. A person who is cautious seeks a strong preponderance of data to prove the position or idea that they are going forward with. And that's like 2/3 of the DBAs I've ever met, right? And it's like, I'm not gonna say we use this new high availability technology until I have tested it myself, that kind of stuff. DISC is really easy to get an assessment on. It's pretty effective, I think. But one of the drawbacks I'd say that exists to DISC is that it does change over time. So when I started on the past board of directors, I was strong in S, stability. That's the kind of person who will want to have small talk with you before we get to the issue. Right? How are your kids? They good? You told me your car broke down. You get that fixed? Oh, okay, good. Now let's talk about your problem. At that time, when I started on the past board, I wasn't in senior leadership. And so I had to spend a lot of time talking to everybody else and making sure, it's all voluntary. Anybody could quit at any time. It's not like your salary depended on it, right? So I want to make sure my relationships were strong. When I was president, I changed. I became much more D-driven towards goals. We got to make this goal. We got to have attendance. We got to have revenue. We got to, that kind of things. And then now I am in a technology evangelist role, and I evaluate much more strongly as an I. That's the kind of person who, an I is the kind of person who makes sure there's cake on your birthday, right? Because it's really important that you feel good as being part of this team, right? That's what I's tend to do. Now, on the other hand, Myers-Briggs is a lot more complicated. There are 16 different types, and I'll tell you more about that as well in a minute. But they are much more accurate in how they predict who you are and how you will prefer to behave. Again, like I said, I do go into a little bit more detail about this in just a minute. And then the last one, the reason this one is important and growing in importance is because it is the most scientifically sound of all of the different psychometric tests. I'm also kind of intrigued by this word down here at the very end, neuroticism. Am I about to hire an axe murderer, or what is this about? What that actually means is how variable your emotional state is. You ever run into a person who's just unflappable? Things are going nuts, and they're like, I'm in control. And then, one of my daughters, for example, is like the least little thing goes wrong, and she's like, oh, everyone hates me. It's like, please, stop. Your neuroticism is showing. So here's another thing I want to point out, too. Tons of study has been invested into this idea of how do we make good leaders. I mean, that's what business schools are practically half about, right? And there's 4 very strong indicators of what makes a good leader, okay? The first is they are not autocrats. They are coaches, right? What's the difference between a coach on a team and a tyrant of a boss, right? Well, the coach says, hey, we're not meeting our goal here. You did a great job on this, on writing these reports and making everybody aware of the situation, but then when you're doing the regular releases and the release notes, it wasn't quite as good as what we had before. Can you do that again, but just with these different things? That's a lot different than, I need these reports to be at least a page long every time they come out, right? Get in there and do better work, right? So that's one thing. Facilitating good communications among the team. Supporting change in ideas. Meeting team goals. All of those are underpinned by good communication. They're not about technology skills. And so, anyone know who this guy is? He's considered one of the best generals. Mad Dog, that's right, Mad Dog. He got that job with the current president solely because he had that nickname. But he's also considered one of the best generals the United States has ever employed since World War II. And West Point said, this is an interesting question. We need to figure out what is most likely to make a West Point graduate a future general. Just based on what happens to them in West Point, they figured out that there's one thing: how well they did on freshman composition, English 101. The better you did in communicating your essential ideas in an essay, the more likely you were to become a general. And this guy is one of the best ever, right? Interesting thought. A lot of us as technologists are like, I have to write the best T-SQL code of all time, or PowerShell. If you want to be the person who gets to the manager of that team, it's probably going to be the person who communicates the best. Okay? So let's talk about some best practices. We're going to come back to a little bit. Oh, you know what? I think let me take one quick look here to see if I had my other details about the Myers-Briggs stuff. I have it at the end. So let me just share my screen for one moment in regular duplication mode so you can see what I have hidden in case there's not enough time. So I did intend for us to come back to it if we don't have enough time. And so I do have a lot of information for you here about the different DISC personality types, about the Myers-Briggs personality types, and so forth. If we have time, we'll come back to it. But I wasn't sure how long all of this would take, so I thought, well, let's push this down to the end. We'll come back to this as time allows. Okay? All right. Sorry about the digression there. Okay, so communication best practices is where we were at. I think it's going to broadcast here in a moment. Try it one more time. There we go. Okay, so keep this in the back of your mind, okay, because I'm going to kind of synchronize some of the different best practices with specific spots on the communication loop, if you will. So let's start with, I'm the sender, right? So I'm the person who's sending out the message. Here is some tips about if I'm going to be the sender. Can you guys read this okay in the back of the room? That's okay? All right. Take the receiver of the message, keep them in mind when you send the message. Read the room, so to speak. Have you ever seen a live comedian? Anyone here? That's my wife and I's thing. We go and see live comedians all the time, and we've seen a lot of big name comedians. Very few of the experienced comedians come out and look around the room in Nashville, Tennessee, and start to tell jokes about, I don't know, the Confederate flag, right? They have read the room, right? Now, I'm not saying I wouldn't laugh my rear end off at those kind of jokes, but take into account where you're at, right? I'm not going to go to the women in technology at luncheon and start well, no, never mind, right? You got to know who you're talking to be an especially effective communicator. Does anyone want to argue about that? Could be fun, I know. So here's one of the, this is something that is extremely common among technologists. A long email discussing all the reasons why we need to make a decision, and then the call for action. We need to spend $300,000 on this pure storage array because all of those details I just told you about how performance is so terrible. This is a debilitating communication problem for technologists. We love those details. Most of us are C's on the disk profile, and so we want to be cautious to make sure we've got all the data lined up to be convincing. In fact, that's not effective. What is very effective is what we call bottom line up front. You're sending an email to your boss, I want to convince you to buy this pure storage array. Here's the call to action. If we get this pure storage array, it's going to fix this, and this problem. It's going to cost a lot, but it's going to save us 3 times more. Here's all my thinking on this. And then, boom, there's all the details, right? You know what your boss is going to do? They're going to read that first paragraph, and they will be happy. They're like, okay, maybe, you know what? They'll actually give you points of credibility even if they disagree with what you say, because you have communicated with them in a way that feels good and natural to them. Whereas if you put all these details, they're not even going to get to your conclusion, and you've lost credibility in that situation, right? It's kind of crazy. So strive for that brevity. Be aware of how they value their time and stay focused on that. Another thing we used to struggle with on the past board and you'll find this in any kind of decision-making body composed of technologists, is we start to talk about a strategic goal. Our strategic goal is that we make the website more user-friendly. Sounds good, right? What's the next thing we start to do as technologists? Oh, yeah, well, first thing we need to do is make sure we get rid of all this Java bullshit, you know. Sorry, right? I mean, literally, when I was on the first pass board of directors, our front end was Cold Fusion, our back end was Oracle. And it would probably take a week to replay all of the arguments that were had about that, right? Because people were trying to solve specific technology problems rather than come to a decisive conclusion to whether this needs to be done or not. Right? So keep that in mind. Bottom line up front. Yeah. Start with your bottom line and go from there and explain things. People will be much happier with that, particularly people higher up in the organization. Another thing to keep in mind, it's a kind of the counterpoint to this whole idea of nonverbal communications, which is there are times when we decide to be quiet or not say anything, and it absolutely sends a message. Frequently, the wrong kind of message. So I worked in one organization where one team leader was a bully and they would lie in wait in the break room for a particular person to walk in, and then they would lay into him very publicly because their thought process was, if they see that I'm serious, they being everybody else on the team, they'll know not to mess with me. So what does it mean when that person, that team leader, does it in front of the director, and the director doesn't say anything? What's that mean? It means go ahead. Green light. Right? And that's why I encourage anybody with an iota of ethical motivation, if you see something that's not right, don't just stand by. You don't have to do a lot. You just have to say, are you okay with that? Everybody now knows you're not okay with that, right? So even when you're not, especially if you have some degree of influence or leadership, if you don't say anything in the wrong situation, you're sending a very loud message, right? Okay. There's also this idea of law of reciprocity. If I make a lot of time for you, and then I'm like, great talk, see ya. How do you feel about that? Yeah, this person clearly didn't want to give me my turn, right? You'll find that people will say of others in a conversation, that person's the best conversationalist I have ever met. Really? What did they talk about? I don't know. They asked me how I was doing, and then they asked a follow-up question on that, and then they asked one more question, all of them open-ended, like, how did you go about resolving that problem? Oh, really? Okay, so what did you do to make sure that didn't happen the next time? That's all they said, but man, they were the best, right? So there's this kind of idea, it's built into many of our social situations, and you'll see all kinds of adages throughout the years about this. Like Benjamin Franklin said, you know how I turn people who are my enemies into my friends? I ask them to loan me a book. I might even already own the book. But think about his time. Books were a lot more expensive then. And if I got a book in loan from someone, they know I owe them. Now they begin to look at me a little bit more favorably because I have to reciprocate. Right? And this kind of permeates our interpersonal communications. If you give someone a turn, if you are a leader and someone who's very quiet hasn't said anything, and say, hey, Jim, you haven't given me your opinion yet. What do you think of this? That is a positive reinforcing behavior. By the way, I don't have a slide for this. But I'm going to mention it in the area about persuasion. What do you think is the right way to make sure you get positive credit in a situation where we're discussing issues that are kind of serious? But you don't really know all the details you think you need to know to make a decision one way or the other. It comes down to values, okay? Let's say, for example, I ask you, should we throw out all of this work that we've been doing using a non-Microsoft technology, and should we switch to Microsoft's technology? The right answer in terms of your personal credibility will always be what gets closest to matching the values of our team. Okay, so hang with me here. When I worked for NASA in the 80s through the early 90s, we were building the air and water recycling system that's in the space station. And yeah, I was good at Fortran, people. If we were asked, should we throw out all this Fortran stuff and move to C? The value that we presented as a team to the mission of NASA was, we have to keep these astronauts alive. Will this change improve that outcome? I don't think it would. Because we can write just as a reliable code with something we know really, really well, more so than something we don't know well. So my value is on the health and well-being of the astronaut. So I could say, I don't know a lot about C. I haven't learned that language yet, but I do know that, that we will have no issues with health and welfare of the astronauts if we stick with what we got. Even if the boss decides to do something different, I will get credibility points because I reinforced the shared values of the team. Later, I went to a Big Four accounting firm, and what do we care about there? What do accountants always care about? Money, right? It's like, hey, would this change in languages enable us to make more money? Yes, it would, because Fortran's not a hot happening language. Oh, okay. Kevin, what do you think? Well, I think we could make a lot more money if we did that. All right. Yeah. So again, I may not have won the argument, but I will win the credibility debate. And finally, I went to work in the industry making tools for DBAs, and our emphasis then was how quickly we got products to market. So you're going to have to take some time and figure out what is the true kind of unspoken value of the team. Don't even bother reading the corporate mission statement, because that's all baloney. We all know that, right? You ever stand in line, you know, at the Avis counter, and you see the mission statement over there, and it's like, we strive to, it's like, I have not experienced any of those customer service attributes. You know, it's like, you got to think about what is it your team really cares about. So in the, you know, again, in the software development industry, we wanted to get software out fast. It's like, would this change in programming languages enable us to write code faster? Yes or no? If it does, then I should support that, because that's our value. And so even if we decided not to do that, people would say, well, that was good input. I appreciate that, Kevin. That was good. Right? So let's talk about some best practices for building that message you're going to send out. One thing that a lot of us as IT people don't do, and we don't realize that we're bigots about our favorite technology, right? Again, in my experience with Oracle people, I was constantly having, you'll laugh with me about that. I was constantly having to say, no, SQL Server is fully capable of supporting this workload. But that's my opinion. You know what would really make sure we know this? Let's run some benchmarks of our own. I actually had to get good at doing benchmarks for that very reason. But to clarify whether something is empirically true or it's an opinion-based communication. So make sure you explicitly state that, and you will have more of those credibility points in your communications. Avoid jargon. I had one friend who, when I was working at NASA, he was working for the US Army Missile Command, and anytime he wanted to shut down an argument, he just started talking about fiber. And it's like, well, we got to get the FDDI in, and, you know, and started throwing all these acronyms around, and people just glaze, and, you know, their head would go. Remember, that's what happens when we use all of our language-specific kind of idioms and jargon and things like that, okay? Another thing that I find we do not do enough as IT people is we don't make it simple, okay? And the best way to make a message simple is to use a relatable analogy. And when I say relatable, I mean not necessarily to me, but to the person who is receiving my message, right? So years ago when my grandmother was still alive, she was like, how come data people make a good living? I'm like, yeah, that's a good question. So I said, hey, this was still in the era of landlines. I said, how long does it take you to look up other people with the same last name as you in Los Angeles? Well, she lives in LA area. And she's like, well, 3 phone books this thick. She's like, well, Cassetti's, there's several people named Cassetti, so I just flipped to C, and there's Cassetti's. I'm like, okay, cool. Now, how long would it take you to find all the Patricias? That's her first name. She's like, oh, that'd take a long time. I said, well, that's part of my job, is to make you able to find Patricias in just the same amount of time as in Cassetti. She's like, oh, that makes sense. I kind of see why they would pay you for that. I said, no, that's not the end of the story. I have to do this for 4,000 people at the same time. And she's like, oh, okay, I totally get it now, right? It's like, because that's the world she lived in, right? You've got to make your message meaningful to the world they live in. You'll find salespeople do this all the time. They're like, hey, what sports team do you care about? You're like, what's this sports ball you speak of? They're like, okay, I got to move on to some other analogies here, because they're looking for some way to find some common ground with you, right? And we need to do the same thing with each other, right? Because I could talk about, the short. I grew up in Alabama, Crimson Tide, Roll Tide football. I could use football analogies all day long, but a lot of people are like Kevin. It's not football. That's American rules football. Real football involves a round ball that you kick with your foot. So it needs to be something that's meaningful to your audience, right? Not necessarily just meaningful to you. And another thing I always encourage people to do, and this is something that is a problem both with those of us who are older and those of us who are younger, is picking the right channel for the message. So I'll see people, particularly the millennials I work with, who are like sending me text messages. And I'm like, oh, no, you don't. This is when my wife needs me to get eggs and milk. Or really important stuff is coming to me in Slack with big attachments. I'm like, no. Email is where we have permanent record of our conversation and large files you need to move. So I have this kind of set in my mind is what is the right channel for the communication. And you may not agree with me, even though I'm right. But what you do need to do, is work out with your team which of these you use. Because what we find in a lot of places is you'll have this whole horrible hodgepodge of some people using Slack for some things, some people using email for the exact same thing, and now we cannot follow a conversation or set of decisions from end to end without it being a disaster, right? Got to come to agreement on that. Now, if I am the person who is receiving the message, again, over in the upper right corner of our communication loop, and just a little meme for you there, where is the Batman? How many of us have been in a situation in which we are in a conversation and you see that the other person is really kind of glazed over, just waiting for their turn to talk, right? They spent this whole time thinking about what they're going to say next that's really smart. So I encourage us to, live in the world that we want to see happen. So let's be fully present in our conversations. I had a manager who changed my life because every time I had something serious to talk about with her, she would say, hang on. And she'd take out her phone and she'd turn it off and she'd put it in a drawer and she'd close the drawer. I'm like, holy crap, I'm getting the full attention of my amazing manager, right? So when we are fully present and you broadcast that, the sender of the message, remember? Reciprocation, they will feel the need to reciprocate in the same way. It becomes a better conversation because of that. Another thing that you want to do is you want to practice the feedback skills of an active listener. If you just Google active listening, you'll see massive amounts of information about this. And there's this comedian, Chris Rock. You ever heard Chris? Awesome comedian. Does this whole shtick about, I get home from work, really just want to sit down and relax a little bit, but my wife has to tell me about her whole day. And he's like, okay, so I've memorized these things where I'm like, okay, every 3 seconds say, and then eventually throw in oh, no, and then he's like, oh, and then every now and then just throw in, I told you that woman was crazy, because it's always some woman at work that she's mad at that's mad at her, But eventually she picks up on that, right? You got to be sincere, and the best sincerity as an acknowledging statement is to either, not just to have an acknowledging statement, but to repeat back in one of two ways what they have just told you. A summary, which is, so you're telling me this is going to be a really expensive problem to solve. right? So that's all the data we got, and so I'm putting that back. Or to paraphrase back what they have told you. To paraphrase, so you've told me a lot about what Pure can do for us. What else should I know about this, right? So paraphrase or summarize. And then also this really interesting loaded word, empathize. So when we hear the word empathize, that often is received in our head as the receiver as the word sympathize. What's the difference between empathy and sympathy? We measured those on a scale. Sympathy is when I say, oh, that is terrible. Somebody should do something about that. That's a very dicey place to be if you were actually a manager or have some authority in a situation. Empathy is to say, you're telling me that you worked on this all week and they just threw it away at the end of the week? You must be so frustrated. Empathy is to recognize the emotion. Sympathy is to recognize the emotion and propose solutions to it, okay? And empathy is powerful. Sympathy is dangerous because it bonds you to the thing in question and it implies you're going to do something about it. You're going to participate some way. So if you're in an argument with a teenage daughter, theoretically, and you refuse to acknowledge their emotions, like, don't feel that way, or, oh, come on, why are you reacting like that? What happens to a person's emotions in the situation when you refuse to acknowledge their emotions? It amplifies things. They ratchet up. Now I have to get louder for you to see how this is really affecting me. If, on the other hand, you acknowledge the emotion, the studies show that the resultant behavior is pretty universal. So if I say, wow, you were really torn up about this, tell me more. What happens is the person who is extremely emotional lets out their breath, and a lot of the tension comes out with that breath. And they're now ready to be a little bit more productive in the conversation. Whereas if I say, Emily, why would you ever feel that way? She's like, because I have a stupid dad. No, sorry. And now she's twice as mad, right? So that's a secret superpower. Another superpower, which I'll throw up here, is to understand the power of silence, okay? Particularly if you are asking for answers and you're not getting truthful or genuine answers. So if you're like, why are we behind on this project? And the person answers, and you are still tuned into the conversation, but you don't say anything. What happens to people is our brain really focuses in on the period of time of the silence. How many of us were in the keynote this morning? A lot of us? At least half of us. Anyone notice the brief pause that our fourth demo of the morning gave us? What happens when we realize that there's this kind of pregnant pause, full of anticipation? Time slows down in our brain, and it feels like it's taking about 4 times as long as it actually does. And people hate when they are the focus of attention. They will spill the beans on everything if you can just hold your lips shut for a few minutes. In fact, there's some studies that show if you are the subject of the question, 1 second feels like 7 seconds. It's like, why are we behind on this? I was terrible at this because I'm like, I want to be your friend. So I would have props ready on my desk when I had to ask someone on my team about it. I'd be like, let me read this piece of paper while you collect your answer, And they're like, oh, I sweat. So that's a superpower. But as I was saying, one of the things that you pair these listening skills with is questioning skills. So you use open-ended questions. Don't say, do you think that was a good idea? How many answers are there to that? Typically 2, right? It's binary. Yeah, it was a good idea, or no, maybe it wasn't a good idea. But if you say, instead of that, you say, how come this decision didn't get us to where we wanted to be? Now you have invited a conversation where you can get some real information, and then you can probe again for that additional information, right? So you got to seek for the answer, and you got to probe for that answer using good questioning as well. All right, how are we doing on time? And we go till 5. All right. All right. Anyone want to learn more about persuasion? Does that sound good? I mean, there's other things we can talk about. We got a lot of good stuff here. So with persuasion, there's, I guess I should back up a little bit about persuasion. You're not going to be persuasive if you are deficient in what is expected of you in your job. That's the first thing to know. Because you're already in a kind of a credibility deficit, right? If you're a DBA who can't restore a down database, right? People are not going to want to listen to you when you propose we spend $40,000 for this new something or other, right? This new consulting service that will be really great for us. So you have to be at least competent at what you're supposed to be doing there in the job, right? But let's assume all of us here are at that level of competency in our job. We're doing a good job. Nobody's complaining about us. Then we want to make some changes. How do we get that through in our workplace? Or maybe, you know, at the hobby group that we're a part of, or at the volunteer center. There's basically 8 different ways you can do this, and they are grouped into 3 main groups. They're related. You'd think rational appeal and intimidation are not related, but they're kind of, as I mentioned, they're kind of overloaded terms. They have, in the communication sciences world, they have their own meaning for us here. So when we talk about logical appeals, one of the things that's interesting about this is that when IT people are trying to persuade the boss or the team to do something, it's almost always based on the logic of a situation, right? What are the facts? The problem with this particular approach is that it only works if your audience is rational. Now, that's great a lot of the time because our boss worked their way up through the ranks of IT, and that's how they make decisions, is what are the facts? I'll balance them out, and if it's a good cost versus benefits outcome, then I'll go for it. On the other hand, I have a friend who worked for a person at a big hospital chain in their IT department, and they were the youngest person ever to make director in their company. And at that time, one of the main things that their database team was assessed on was how quickly they got new servers out in the field, because they were in a period of rapid growth. This was around SQL Server, well, this was SQL Server 2000. It was before 2005 had come out. And so they had to get these boxes, physical machines, rolled out to the offices quickly. That's what this director monitored very, very closely. And she went to the director and said, hey, we get lots of calls for support on these. I propose that we implement all these best practices for setting up our SQL servers, you know, for the number of files per database, right? And MTBI should go in this place, and we should turn off certain defaults and put in other values. They're like, don't care, no thanks. Because all that extra work slows down how quickly we get our SQL servers out into the field. And then later on, she came back and she said, yeah, you know, we're getting a lot of support calls on this, and it's a lot of extra work. And they're like, sorry, don't care. And then, you know, she's using all these rational approaches. And then finally, she went back. We talked about it, and she went back and she completely rejiggered her approach. She said, you know, I really wish we didn't have this image problem. I said, what do you mean? Well, as a team, you know, things aren't going great. People notice how much time it takes for us to answer trouble tickets because we have so many support calls to process. And the director said, well, what can we do about this? And she said, well, I have this kind of set of best practices I'd like to implement when we roll out a new SQL server. And it'll make most of those go, it's like, make it happen now. Because all this person was motivated by was their ego associated with certain metrics that they cared about that weren't really pertinent to the DBA team, right? So you have to remember what we said at the very beginning. Make your message specific to the person you are trying to influence. If they aren't rational, a rational argument isn't going to win them over. You have to figure out an alternative approach. So rational appeal is all the good things that will happen, all the benefits in lieu of the costs for a particular proposal I'm putting forward to you. Intimidation, you'll see salespeople use intimidation Again, it's a loaded term. It doesn't mean I'm going to come in and bully you. What it means is I'm going to show you all the negative consequences if you don't do what I recommend. Ever heard of the acronym FUD? Fear, uncertainty, doubt, right? It's like, well, no one ever got fired for buying IBM, but plenty of people got fired for buying a Burroughs or a Sperry or an Amdahl. I'm just showing my age. We had those at NASA when I started. Oracle people all the time, the salespeople would come in and they're like, well, if you don't buy this exit data, then you're not going to be able to get any of your data processed in time. The universe is going to get you. It's like, yeah, that's $1 million. We can afford it. That kind of stuff. So you'll see that happen. They'll try to intimidate you by pointing out all the negative consequences of you not following their prescribed set of recommendations, okay? So one of the things you'll also see on all these slides is you have to have a call for action and then explicitly follow up, okay? If you present a great idea, but you don't say, can we start a proof of concept on this next Wednesday? If you don't actually ask for that, there's a pretty good chance that they'll say, that's a great idea, and then never really authorize you to move forward on that. So that's the other thing that was uncomfortable for me and a lot of the practitioners who are learning how to be more persuasive, had to come to terms with. I don't like to be that direct, but ask for that follow-up. Make a specific pitch, ask for the follow-up, and then give regular status reports on how it's going. If you show that you are successful, you get that kind of reciprocity in the future. You get invited to participate in these kind of trials and new ideas in the future. So emotional appeals. One time when I was a manager, I had a whole team of developers, and at one point I was able to say to them, I was able to hire every one of you. And I hired you because I believed you were the best, the smartest, the most capable people out there. I hate to ask this of you, but I'm going to ask you to deliver. We're going to have to work extra hours to get this done. Do you think you can do it? And if any of you have ever seen a sports movie, this always happens in a sport, right? The coach comes walking in, it's halfway through the big playoff game, he takes his big gulp and he slings it and throws it. The music begins to swell in the background, and everyone's like, yeah, we can do it, boss. They get up there and they do it. You're appealing to their sense of who they could be. That's what inspirational appeal is. Who are we? Well, we're good. But are we the best developers? I think we could be the best developers in this company. And so I only had to use it once, but guess what? We got everything done in time, and I was able to come back later and congratulate them all. It's like, you did it. We've got the lowest bugs. We've got the highest satisfaction. You guys are the best. You got to deliver it in person. Going back to the channels of communication, if you send this in an email, it will not work. Now, how is that different? How is inspirational appeal different from flattery? Flattery is the kind of thing the salesperson says to you, you're smart. I know how smart you are, and you know this is the right. So there's this kind of seed of insincerity about it. There's you can kind of feel dripping from this message a need for self-service. I'm just telling you this so that you'll get. It's like when people tell me, they're like, you were the best looking person I've ever dealt with. It's like, thank you, I appreciate that, but I know you were lying. And then finally, cooperative appeals, right? And there's a lot of different ways to do this, like an alliance. I always used to try and draw in my server team and my SAN team into alliances, because the database was literally, the lifeblood of the business. And so if I had a big project that I needed something to happen, and we didn't have budget for it, if I could go to the SAN team and say, I know you want that new SAN. I need the new SAN for performance. If you and I go in together, I think we can both get this approved, right? They're like, yeah, I didn't think I was going to make a proposal about that, but if I can say we already have a project that really needs it, that'll get my boss to say yes, and you can say you have a project that really needs what I want, and you can tell them that I already approved this, then yeah, let's do that. So alliances work a lot. Another thing too, Consultation, this is one of the few methods of persuasion that actually works at just the very lowest key, smallest level. If I come to you and I ask you, hey, I really need your opinion. What do you think of this choice versus that choice? Well, what am I saying about you? That your opinion, right, that your opinion is one worth seeking out. So it's a tacit compliment, right? I'm saying, hey, you've got good thoughts. I want to hear them. So a lot of times, you'll even see some savvy communicators who will go and ask an opinion from a person. They already know the opinion, but they want them to know that I think highly of your opinion. And so that kind of builds in that reciprocity. So the next time I say, hey, I need somebody to back me up on this, they're like, I know you got my back. You already like what I have to say. And so you get that just by being consultative in your approach instead of I already know all the answers, right? This is the, if you're calling in a debt or asking for a favor, make it about what's doing good. What's in it for me is what that acronym means. What's in it for me? So if I ask the sand person to go in with me on a budget, I got to make clear why they want to do that. Right? Well, we're going to get you that sand that you have always wanted and not been able to get otherwise. And then finally, appealing up. This is really one of the few that are really dangerous. You ever had anyone say, well, we're not doing the things that should be done, so I'm thinking about talking to not my manager, but my manager's manager. Knowing nothing else about the situation, how good of an idea do you think that probably is? You may get what you want, but the blowback will be really, really harsh. So be very careful. I hear people say that too about just like work environment stuff. I'm not being treated well. I think I need to go down to HR. I encourage everyone to remember that HR is there to protect the corporate entity, not the individual, right? And so you can do this, but recognize that it has potential for bad things to happen. All right, how much time do we have left? 2 minutes. Oh, darn, I've got about 20 minutes more content here. I mentioned, the next slide is about telling stories, okay? And I mentioned how analogies are very, very powerful. Part of the reason for that is that there is so much loaded information in talking about a football story, and all we're looking for here in this situation is the first down. We're not trying to get the touchdown. That little analogy right there, we know so much about football that we automatically kind of understand what you're saying. Oh, we just need a small victory, not a big victory, right? So let me go through quickly here about storytelling. Human beings have been telling stories for as long as there have been human beings. Okay? If you're good at telling a story, you will have a superpower, okay? What is remarkable about all of the stories that we remember 3,000 years after they were first written is the emotional impact of those stories. Two young lovers, star-crossed, never really designed in the universe to come together, but they do, okay? The way we make our storytelling a superpower is recognize this acronym, MIP. Memorable, impactful, and personal. And if you're old enough, you will remember where this became part of our culture, okay? And if you're not terribly old, you will see this at play every night at about 11 p.m. when you hear Sarah McLachlan playing music, and you hear usually a white lady saying, did you know that every year 8,000 bunny rabbits are stabbed in the head with the eraser of a pencil? And then you'll see this beautiful little bunny, and it's like shivering, and it's in the rain, and it's hurt, and it's like, but if you give $20 a month to I Want Money for Bunnies, then you can save a bunny's life. So yeah, what happened was in the 70s, one of the Ivy League colleges did a study. And they said, we've been raising a lot of money in our annual alumni fundraiser, but maybe we can do better. So they looked at what they did, And what they had at that time was a bunch of freshmen. They would call all the different alumni from different units. Hey, Mr. Wilson, we see that you were a graduate from the medical school in 1969. We were wondering if you'd like to contribute again to our beautiful Ivy League college. Then they had another, that's what they've been doing for years. Then they had another group in the study that said, hey, Mr. Wilson, we saw you graduate in 1969. We wondered if you'd like to contribute because we need to build a new building. Okay? And it's going to enable people who are in your school, the School of Engineering, to do all these new cool things. Oh, okay. That's a lot more personal, right? And then the third group said, hey, Mr. Wilson, we're wondering if you'd like to contribute again. And I'd like to point out that we're going to use this money to enable Sarah, who comes from a family who has never had a college graduate before, to be able to attend the School of Engineering like you did. She has unbelievable scores. She's never going to get to go to our university unless you contribute. What do you think? You're willing to do that? What was the difference between the second version and the third version? So the second and third were both personal. They're both related to the school and the program within the school that they went to. What's different about the third from the second? You're going to change a person's life forever, right? If you can find stories like that to reinforce your points, even if it's on the level of the team, of the group, of the organization, then you will be a celebrity, right? You will be the person who's like, wow, I just want to hear this person talk every day. Because we remember what is personal and has an impact on other people. If you ever watch a preacher who's really good, they'll always do this. That is their bread and butter, right? Memorable, impactful, and personal. MIP. That is an amazing combination. So has anyone ever contributed to those, starving dogs commercials or children in Africa, right? I tell you, those organizations generate bazillions of, that's an official figure, bazillions of dollars every year because they have found a way to make it about what we really care about, right? So, okay, to wrap up, I've gone over. If you're interested in leadership material, my favorite website, my favorite trainers for leadership is an organization called the Center for Creative Leadership. I've gotten a lot of my training from there outside of the college situation. And also there's a website called Tech Republic that has a whole section related to interpersonal skills and leading a team and doing those kind of things, all right? So that's one set of, also, SQL Pass. We have a personal development a virtual group that meets every month and lots of great sessions there. Okay, and then finally, just in the wrap up here, self-awareness. Remember those best practices. There's a lot of different techniques you can use. Choose the best one for your situation. And then the personal, impactful, memorable stories. All right, so we're all out of time. Appreciate it very much. Don't forget, 2 more sessions in the learning path, so I hope you'll attend those as well. And thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.